it feels like we're at a very tense moment. Does it feel that way to you?
Well, it's extremely dangerous. It has many of the same elements which we saw at the beginning of the war in Iraq. Obviously, the people are different, but the mood music is the same. I think if you just look very narrowly at this episode with Israel and Iran, the Iranians clearly fired first, the Israelis responded, as they have every right to do, but of course that ignores the wider context. I mean, the real danger here is the Trump administration, and clearly has a premeditated agenda. The forces themselves lining up in the Middle East, the Americans themselves appear to be preparing for that. And the British and the Europeans have been sidelined. The sycophancy which we saw demonstrated to the Trump administration by the French and our own government had absolutely no effect whatever on Trump. No. The people who surround Trump now, and particularly John Bolton, his security advisor, have made it very clear that they anticipated and indeed welcomed conflict with Iran for a variety of reasons, partly historic, partly, you know, they do believe, you know, Iran is a major threat to the region, and of course there are elements of truth in that.
Yesterday was a strange day to look at President Donald Trump, wasn't it? It was a day when we finally had a date for Kim Jong-un to meet with Donald Trump. We now know June the 12th, and it's going to happen. We've got a place. So that seemed very positive for a move toward world peace. Meanwhile, the situation with Iran and Israel and the bombing at Syria was very worrying. What makes you think that we won't in a few weeks' time? Because I can remember even you and I speaking about the war of words and the fire and fury he was going to unleash on North Korea if they didn't step down. That seemed like a frightening moment too. And yet here we are with what feels like a peaceful moment on the horizon. What makes you think that his withdrawal from that bill won't lead to success?
Well, you're right, it could be bluster and rhetoric.
Yeah, because that seems to be his tactic,
but
doesn't it?
the two issues are connected, because if Kim Jong-un is going to sign any kind of meaningful agreement in Korea, they have to be confident that the Americans will honour it. And the real significance of pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal is that nobody can have any confidence that an agreement which the Americans have entered into, and which was being honoured. I mean, that was the key point. The inspectors had established that whatever, whether you like the Iranian regime or not, and they do a lot of bad things, that they were fulfilling their part of the bargain.
They've reported 9 times.
And if you know, if the Americans are not willing, or the Trump administration is not willing to accept that a party to an agreement that's honouring it, and just want to walk away, detonate the whole thing, then there is no trust.
You mentioned John Bolton, the US National Security Advisor. He's reported as saying that any European countries' businesses, that includes us still for now, will have to stop doing business in Iran within 6 months, or they will all face similar sanctions. You know, nobody will be spared.
Well, that's a real threat to us.
What does that mean? You know, because if, you know, what does that mean for oil prices, for other things here?
Well, it means two things. First of all, that any British companies that are involved in doing business with Iran, quite legally, are potentially subject to sanctions. You know, the way that American sanctions work, it's called extraterritorially. You don't need to do any mischief in America to be subject to their sanctions. And that is a real risk. And I think the European countries are going to have to act together to protect their own companies who are subject to American sanctions. As far as oil prices are concerned, the world is different from what it was 10 years ago. There's a lot more American oil. But nonetheless, we've seen oil prices moving up. A combination of the loss of Iranian oil, it's about 4 million barrels a day, together with any confrontation in the Gulf itself, which could happen. You know, Iran is aligned with Qatar. There is potential for conflict there. You could have a major oil shock, and we do need to be prepared for it. I don't know whether the government's doing any preparatory planning. I asked Boris Johnson in Parliament a couple of days ago to make sure we were.
A word a little bit about that extraordinary apology by Theresa May to Abdel Hakim Belhaj and Fatemeh Boudjikar, who were both found themselves with the complicity of MI6 being taken and tortured to Libya. Now, you know, obviously a different government, a different situation, but the apology goes out. It's very difficult, isn't it, I would imagine, for governments to decide priorities. Back then, the priority would have been peace, some sort of peace with Libya, some sort of relationship with Libya. Libya felt like a terrorist threat. There were problems there. And then in hindsight, bad things are done, so say in the name of good. Is that a challenge in government always, you having been there?
Yes, it is, but I mean, this particular episode was appalling. I mean, extraordinary renditions is the jargon about it, which is effectively kidnapping somebody illegally and then...
Wouldn't that happen now, though, if somebody felt someone feared were involved in ISIS?
Tortured by a particularly odious regime. I mean, I think Theresa May rightly apologised, but if you're trying to understand the context, we're trying to understand why Tony Blair reached his agreement with Libya, there was originally a justification for having sensible relations with them, but there are certain limits which you shouldn't be crossing, and you know, kidnapping, collusion in torture are things that, as a democratic regime, we should not in any sense be condoning.